I have with me a copy of the Analects of Confucius. I'm afraid this is not an antique, but just an imitation. Nevertheless, the Analects is our major source of information for the teachings of Confucius. It is now time that we look more carefully at the text. The term 论语, first of all, means quite simply a collection or compilation of sayings, referring especially to the sayings of Confucius. This has been the standard interpretation of the title of the work since the Han Dynasty. So the translation Analects is actually quite apt. The root meaning of the word analects in Greek and Latin means basically what has been gathered up or collected. The 论语 is primarily a collection of conversations and sayings of Confucius. But there are also sayings attributed to his main disciples. I will introduce you to the different types of material contained in the Analects in a moment. Now, the 论语 was probably compiled by second and third generation disciples of Confucius in the 4th century BCE. Although it is conceivable that the collection began with the first generation disciples of Confucius. The text, as it now stands, is divided into 20 chapters or books. Each book contains a number of recorded sayings or conversations. First, it contains sayings attributed to Confucius, and these form the majority. For example, the 论语 begins with these famous words. The master said, "To practice what one has learned regularly, is this not a delight? And to have friends come from afar, is this not a joy?" The second half of this saying is used as a welcome in many events even today, including the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. The concept of learning, as we will see, plays an important role in Confucian philosophy. There are also reported conversations between Confucius and his disciples. Typically, these are in the form of a question put to Confucius by one of his students. For example, Ziyou, one of his disciples, asked about filial piety. Confucius said, "Nowadays, being filial is taken to mean being able to provide for one's parents. But even dogs and horses are so provided. If respect is lacking, what is the difference?" Filial piety is another key concept that we will need to examine carefully later. Some of the passages are conversations between Confucius and certain rulers or high-ranking officials. For example, Duke Ding, who ruled the state of Lu at that time, asked Confucius, "The ruler employs his ministers. The ministers serve the Lord. How should these be carried out?" And Confucius replied, "The ruler employs his ministers with propriety. The ministers serve the Lord with conscientiousness." The Chinese word translated here as propriety is 礼. Its basic meaning is ritual, and it is one of the most important concepts in Confucian philosophy. There are also reports of Confucius' actions in specific situations. For example, when the master was in the temple of the Duke of Zhou, as one report has it, he asked about every detail of the activities there. Some of the sayings collected in the Analects are attributed to the main disciples of Confucius. Again, one example should suffice to make the point. Master You said, "The gentleman cultivates the roots. Once the roots are established, the way will grow." being filial and respectful to one's parents and elders, this indeed is the root of humaneness. The concepts of the gentleman, filial piety, and humaneness will be very important to our examination of Confucian philosophy. In a few places, we also find sayings attributed to significant figures of old, such as the Duke of Zhou. And there are some miscellaneous sayings as well. In one passage, for example, 8 outstanding officers of the Zhou dynasty were identified. These examples should give us a flavor of the nature of the Analects. The Analects has exerted a tremendous influence on later Chinese scholars and intellectuals. Let me just share with you one particular comment by a later Confucian scholar that I particularly like. He said, having read the Analects, some would not be affected at all. Some would become fond of 1 or 2 sayings. Some would come to treasure it, and some, having read it, without even knowing it, dance with irrepressible joy. Now, it's difficult, of course, to experience this kind of reading in the classroom or in a MOOC setting. This kind of reading really suggests a very powerful experience at the moral and existential level. Nevertheless, it is important for us to try to understand why the text is held in such high regard throughout Chinese history and what it has to offer even today.